you so much for joining us for the second Mater.Live event. This evening's event is going to be chaired by Matthew Rowe, and he'll be speaking to Shahpour, Pouyan and Elena Khurtova. I'm Maddie Rose Hills, and I'm the curator of Mater. Mater is a brand new web-based research platform that has been launched for just over a month now. We have a website which has been built by Victor Wang, and the website link is www.mater.digital. Hopefully some of you have been able to check it out already and read some of the amazing texts and listen to some of the audio pieces that are up there. We have got 15 contributions from artists, writers, philosophers, researchers, seed keepers, a really sort of like broad range of people all writing on the topic of materials. And alongside that is this program of live events, which this is number 2, and we have 2 more coming up afterwards. We're kindly supported by Arts Council England through public funding from the National Lottery. And special thanks this evening to our panelists for being here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So to briefly introduce who's joining us this evening before they go on and properly get into their work. So Matthew Rowe is a philosopher, writer and lecturer / tutor at City and Guilds of London Art School and the Centre for Language, Culture and Communication at Imperial College London. Elena Khurtova is an interdisciplinary artist living and working in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, reflecting on the interplay of fragility and resilience of human and environmental conditions. Khurtova's work investigates notions of care and control. Shahpour Pouyan, whose work is a commentary on power, domination and possession through the force of culture, was born in Iran. He has an MFA in Integrated Practices and New Forms at Pratt Institute, New York, and has an MFA in painting from Tehran University of Art. I'm going to shortly be handing over to Matthew, who will be chairing this event. But before I do that, I'd love to hear from you, Matthew, a little bit more about your text. So I should say that all of these 3 people here have written texts for Mater. But yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about your text, because I know that that will probably contribute to a lot of the ideas we're going to be discussing today.
Maybe, who knows? Hope so. Is there anything in particular you want me to talk about, or do you want me to just go off on one by myself?
I'll leave that to you. You go on.
Okay, so the nature of my text really it was quite a small one that came from a larger one, and it's called The Unseen Horde, and it was the basic proposition was that we quite often we do have the idea that hoarding is a bad thing and that it manifests in a single geographical place. And when it manifests in that particular place, I think it does 2 things. The first is that it reflects back on the psychological and health state of the person who also occupies the same geographical space. So that we say that they are unable to live anymore, and that the hoard of material they have has become a problem for them, as it were. The second thing I think that happens is the material in that settled geographical place becomes a problem for material. What that means is that the nature of the hoard means that the objects that we all surround ourselves with, if I look at you guys here and I look at myself, we are all surrounded by objects and possessions, but they are all objects that are obviously existing within the world of care and the world of culture and the world of human. I mean, you are in control of your objects in your room, as it were. But the idea of the hoard is that they stop becoming objects and they just become eventually stuff, and you become subject to the stuff, and that is the reason why they become a problem. That was the traditional way of looking at the physical hoard in a single geographical place. And then I posited the idea of the unseen hoard, which was the hoard of the surplus of materials that is a result of us choosing or having the ability to choose. So the example I used was, if you go down any high street in any town, there might be 4 or 5 different coffee shops. They're all going to produce they're all going to have their own stock, they're all going to produce their own stuff during the day, and they're all going to have a surplus of stuff. That surplus of stuff is a direct result of our defining ourselves as agents that can choose what we do. In that, what it means is, in order for us to exercise a choice, we must be presented with a choice, and being presented by a choice necessitates that things will go to waste. So what I was saying is that we have the same philosophy of material, and that it becomes it turns into stuff, is manifested, but it's an unseen problem because it doesn't happen to us in one particular geographical place. It is just a result of the cultural way that we interact with stuff. So it's just basically that the fact that we have choice makes us have to relate to objects via having an unseen horde of objects that are never going to be chosen. The unseen horde is the unchosen of us as agents. And I think it's quite interesting in that, to relate it to Elena and Shahpour's kind of work, in that I think especially with soil, there's an idea with soil especially being an unchosen kind of material, which is something I might want to talk about later. And I think what you do, Shahpour, as well, is actually you talk about the choices that people make with materials to make them part of cultural choices, as opposed to not being cultural choices. So that's why I see the fit between some of the things I've said and some of the things you've said. But that's my overview. Is there anything else you want to say, Maddie, about me?
Well, no, I think that is really interesting. And actually, when you were saying that, it reminded me of a conversation I had with Shahpour about body, what people in different cultures do with bodies after death. And I actually think we spoke about, I think I maybe spoke about in that conversation, this idea of like hoarding bodies, and the way that, we
do hoard bodies.
Text, so I'm sure that I just suddenly was thinking that was quite an interesting link. But yeah, I also will say that Matthew taught me philosophy when I was studying materials on my master's. And so that was why I particularly wanted to hear him in conversation this evening, because I found a lot of really interesting elements being sort of, discussed around materials that I was working with. So
I wasn't teaching you, Maddie, we were just having a conversation, slightly different.
Well, I don't know, effective, but okay, well, it seems like a good point for me to leave you to speak. I will be putting a PowerPoint presentation on in the background now, just so that you can get an idea as the audience of, some of the works, but it will sort of end in about, that PowerPoint presentation will end in about 10 minutes. And please do write any questions in the chat. That would be super appreciated. And Matthew is going to try his best to answer those.
I will try my best to answer an interview. So if you have any comments or questions for any one of us, I will try and put to be the channel that puts them through there. But if I do miss them, please try again and do it at the end. We've had one comment already. That's great. If you saw the rest of this room, you would see how surrounded by stuff on the edge of hordes it is. But thankfully, you can't see it. My objects in here are out of control. Slightly.
Okay, great. I'm going to share screen now.
Okay. So if I was to begin the conversation, I might ask in a kind of vanity, self-glorifying way about that idea of hoarding bodies and hoarding materials and going to waste, and how that might come up in either of your two practices.
Well, Matthew, I think, first of all, the question of hoarding, I can really relate, I think, also from my background. Growing up in the Soviet Union, almost every family was up for hoarding, because everyone believed that there will never be enough of something, and everything might be of interest at a certain point and might become useful. So I think I can relate it also with my body, growing up in these apartments or garages or daches full of stuff. But also through my practice, at a certain point, I worked a lot with clay, and at a certain point it became tones of clay. And at a certain point it became clear that it's the same clay that I'm working with. I'm just like collecting all different bodies of clay And it's in my studio, and it comes from one project into another project. But it had enormous effect, I think, on my practice. And this fascination, I think, with the masa also was with the heaps of soil that I saw every so often around. And yeah, that made me look deeper into what is it behind it, how this soil is being displaced, what is going on really. And now I'm based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. So of course the Netherlands has very specific relation with soil because it's kind of never enough of it here. And it's very controlled how the soil is displaced. And every time there is an excavation, maybe for construction or for something, then the stones of soils are being controlled and checked and analyzed. But depending on what and so, it can kind of directly go into a new location or has to be remediated. And in that way, there are these very specific terrains. In the Netherlands, they call them grondbanken, so banks of earth, we could say, where soils are stored. And indeed, often it could be perceived as a kind of place where soils are hoarded, but at the same time, it is often a waste material. Of course, indeed, by European legislation, displaced soil is considered waste, and it's enormous amounts of it.
There's two things I want to pick up about that, and I'll come to it a bit later just to warn you. The idea of displaced soil I found fascinating, and the idea of displaced soil as waste I found really fascinating as well. So I want to talk about those later. But Shahpour, initial thoughts from you?
Regarding displacement of soil, or?
Oh, well, actually, to be honest, I was thinking about, you had something really interesting in your in the thing you wrote for Mater, which was about the idea of basically the different funeral rites and the idea of using bodies and your bodies being better served by being food for the world, as it were. And that got me to the idea of thinking that in a Western European tradition, things like graveyards are effectively hoarding bodies. But in one particular place, it's an unproblematical hoard, but it's a culturally given hoard. And it seemed to be an odd thing to do, but I like reimagining things that way.
Well, I think it's not just regarding the Western European, I think, as a practice. It's quite quite shared in all, I would say, Abrahamic religions, that they, hoarding dead bodies. And it's fascinating. I think the largest graveyard in the world is in Iraq.
Oh, okay.
And is a city. It's just a endless city with graves, and it's quite fascinating. So it's hoarding of memories and hoarding of bodies, and I always thought that I'm thinking, so if we keep going for another 5,000 years, is it going to be any place for the live people on the planet? Because we're just going to cover the whole, surface with different graves. And in contrast to this, I found it very fascinating to see that how there is a practice of putting the bodies in nature to be eaten and recycled by, by the animals. And it's quite amazing. I just came back from Iran, and I was in Yaz city in the inland central part of the country, which is a place of the very interesting Zoroastrian towers of silence. And I went to visit these sites, which is quite amazing. So for the first time, I could see it in person, the place that used to be a place of, a funeral and also leaving the body for nature. And it's quite amazing, because when you go there, it's just one tiny building on top of a hill, And we don't know, thousands and thousands or maybe millions of people, they just been there and they just went to the, you know, to the air and they eat them. And it was amazing to just see that, how they made the system to just not basically holding the bodies. And then I understood that actually, because the first Persian tribes that they settled in Iran, we are talking about between 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. They've been these Aryan tribes that they came from Siberia and North Central Asia. And this was a practice used by tribes in that region. And there are some ideas, they believe that maybe the Persians, they brought this practice with them to Iran. And quite amazing, because we see the same practice somehow, not exactly the same, but similar practices happening today in Tibet. And I found it fascinating the way that they put the body in the nature to be, you know, consumed by the birds, and then they go collect the bones, and then they bring them to their, you know, ordinary life. As that's the place actually I went 2 weeks ago. It's the Tower of Silence. I went 2 weeks ago. I have the image right now, and I found it fascinating. You know, the way that there is not a consumption of death as we have it in modern religions. In fact, is the consumption of body by the nature, and that's it. So that's what I can add to this conversation. Yeah.
So I think that's incredibly interesting, and it's to go with the displaced soil that Elena was talking about, and soil as waste. It's, I mean, you know, I don't want to spend the whole time talking about graveyard rituals, but to start off of the way in, it strikes me that whenever you place a body in the ground, you are going to displace soil of some kind. But that's just what happens, because the body's going to, the soil is going to emerge from it. And also what's going to happen is that the body in the ground is gradually going to disperse into the soil around it over time. Those are the other things that are just going to happen. And so what I find quite interesting then is the thought that the body then becomes part of the soil has body in it, and yet if you move it, it might get treated as waste. In other words, the very thing that has sought to preserve the body is then going to get treated as a waste product afterwards at some point, which just seems, you know, madly paradoxical in some particular way. So I think the whole idea, more fundamentally, of what we count as waste and what we don't count as waste is extremely interesting in both your works.
The image, Shahpour, you show looks incredible. The place looks fantastic, but it also makes me think of the nature of the soil, of the landscape. I wonder if there is a relation which type of soil there is around, whether it's possible to dig and have like these composting processes, or if it's a stone, whether it's really totally different process possibilities, and that's why also this exposure to air and animals is really necessary. So it makes me also question how these burial practices, I guess, are related to to the type of landscape we have.
I just know a little bit regarding the philosophy of doing this practice, which is based on these principles in their religion, that they believe they shouldn't pollute the 4 sacred elements of water, air, fire, and earth. So they couldn't bury the body, they couldn't put it in fire, they couldn't, you know, throw it in the sea. So the only option they had was just leave it for nature, you know, for that. I don't know if it helps, you know, regarding the question you had.
Yeah, no, it's incredible, very interesting. And Matthew, to go back to the point of that it does become waste, yeah, it is interesting. And I think in Europe, maybe there is a certain time frame of the duration, how long the cemetery, let's say, exists, how long the bodies are placed there. And yeah, if you take it on a longer term, we don't know what's really happening. I look sometimes into examples, actually from the Soviet times, let's say after the on the territory of Russia, and for sure in former Soviet territories. After the revolution, many religious cemeteries were transformed into being stadiums, because as much as churches, of course, we also like replaced into cultural institutions, sometimes totally demolished. Then this incredible space, they just erased all the gravestones and used them as sports stadiums, and sometimes even playgrounds or parks. So that's also, in a way, different idea of not really replacing the ground, but really changing the function on top.
That's really interesting. The thing that strikes me about the idea of soil being waste, and I think this applies to some of the materials that you're working with as well, Shahpour, with clay, and with what we count as waste. If you count soil as waste, it kind of presupposes there's something that it's for, that has a purpose. And if it doesn't meet that purpose, then it's waste soil. In other words, there's good soil and there's bad soil, if you see what I mean. And there's a good form of material and there's a bad form of material. And there's a good form of a body and a bad form of a body. Yeah. And that strikes me, one of the things in your work as well, Shahpour, that you mentioned was about the fact that you do, that when you have pottery, it's a preservation of some kind as well. In other words, it's a guarantee that it's not waste at some point. You know, it's a guarantee that this thing is precious. Yeah. As well. And I think that's really interesting. And that kind of goes back to the element of hoarding. We have got a question about hoarding, which I'll come to. And the idea that hoarding seems to be, you want to keep the material close and to preserve it because you don't want to throw it away. But in doing so, you actually don't preserve it in a way that keeps it valuable, if you see what I mean. Whereas both of you guys seem to be working with ideas of other people, things that aren't valuable, but keeping them valuable by doing something with it. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about the idea of making materials valuable by your manipulations of them, even though they might not be initially valuable.
Just one thing I can add regarding clay is, as I talked about it in the text, is the fact that I went to a museum and I always look down to clay, to ceramic, as an art medium, until the moment that I realized that it's the most resilient medium in art that could survive forever, and we don't have any other medium that could, you know, have this power to stay, you know, around forever. And I always notice that, oh, these are breaking. So the first thing we think about clay, about ceramic and pottery, is that, oh, they always are in danger of, you know, breaking down to pieces. But the fact that, yeah, they can break, but it doesn't mean that they're gonna, you know, just, you know, result, or like you're gonna lose them as, you know, just recycled in nature. Is impossible, and they can stay around forever. Yeah. And that was the very important moment for me to understand and appreciate the medium. The other things, the other thing regarding your question is, I think clay. So what I do, I mean, you take the clay. Clay is soil with water. Yeah. Then you shape it, and then you cook it to lose all the water, even the water you got in molecules in the clay, to make it as hard as possible without water. And I quite enjoy the, you know, the philosophy behind the physical, you know, interaction we have with the clay. So we take it from very, from a wet piece of dirt to make it absolutely dry, like a dirt, but much drier because we removed every possibility of water in this matter. And then the result is just the same thing. But the whole process it happened is just shaping and removing the water from it. And I found it very fascinating, the philosophical the interaction we have with actually the soil.
Sure. I mean, it strikes, I'll get to it in a second, Elena, but it strikes me that initial soil, that goes back to the last discussion we had, the initial soil you could use could be soil that contains, bodies, dissolved bodies, things from the past, organic stuff, everything. In other words, that soil has a history, and it's kind of being baked into a permanent thing in your practice, which I think is extremely interesting. I mean, I can imagine a cyclical mode of Elena and your work kind of coming together, if you see what I mean.
Definitely, yeah. I look at the cycle of matter more closely, and that's why for me it's so important that clay or soil doesn't get fired. It just by drying it and drying really like a lot, you can make it super strong. But then again, once you expose it to water, then it becomes moldable, and you can shape again and you can create again. And yeah, I see lots of beauty in it. And in a way, I think for me, it's exactly the opposite. This desire to keep a continuous form of relation with material. That's what I'm trying to explore. And originally, I worked a lot with clay, and it started actually with porcelain, let's say the finest of clays. And slowly, by exploring different clays, I realized that it's everywhere under our feet. So in the Netherlands, we can dig almost everywhere and get clay. And by doing so, I also started to look closely at soil, and that's of course incredible, because we could say almost every soil contains a little bit of clay, and you can really process it indeed into the clay that's suitable for pottery or any other work. But this ritual of kneading clay, I see lots of beauty in it, and it's kind of fascinating. What I think, Shahpour, you call also meditative process with using craft or applying decoration. For me, this interaction with clay or with soil has lots of beauty just in the kneading and not necessarily becoming as a specific form. That's why I also try to bring it at the in focus through performance, which basically is about repeating the section of kneading soil, mixing it with water, and repeating the moving with my hands. Then the mass slowly becomes drier and drier, and then applying again water, and like this cycle continues.
So, Christine in the comments has said it's also quite interesting to consider materials that decay or don't last, so completing a kind of circle. And I think what I'd quite like to talk about next is that idea of the circle and the linear kind of process, stuff that goes in a straight line in the process and stuff that gets circular and repeated, etc. It strikes me in your practice, Shahpour, that you're absolutely right. And what struck me was that we find pottery in soil. It doesn't dissolve in soil. It stays there as you say, it's everlasting, as it were. That once it's made, it's there, and if it breaks on the ground, gets salt, and then I dig it up again. If that makes sense. But in the process of making it, I presume that the water extraction, the water is a waste. If that makes it, because of the focus of the project, what this soil is for clay is for porcelain or pottery, and therefore water is a waste, if that makes sense. Now that seems to be just it's interesting itself. In other words, there are that linear thing and those circular things within it, but it's interesting to think, again, I go back to the waste of soil, because it presupposes that soil is for something, and And soil does seem to be a receptacle of memory, which we don't take to be going that much, because it is just a place of our past. You dig down into soil to get to the past. So I quite like the idea of pottery being places where the past is made everlasting.
It's something very poetic about using clay, and it's a very important Iranian poet, and from the medieval time, and his poetry, Khayyam, his poetry is regarding joy in life and enjoying the moment, and the fact that we are all going to die, and we're going back to soil. And in one of his poems, he's talking about a piece of pottery, or about a vase that someone holding their hand, and he says that the handle on the vase is used to be a hand of a lover. So it's amazing that how much how much the idea of soil is related to the past, to history. And in another poem, he's talking about how when you die, you are in the same level as the people who died 7,000 years ago, and you are in the same level.
Yeah.
And you are similar. So, and doesn't matter you are the king or the peasant. And I never worked on anything exactly related to this poem, but I can see it every day in my practice, that when I work with a piece of clay, it could be a part of human body, and it just makes it quite poetic, the fact that
sure.
you're working with it. And it's very, it's also, clay has a very important biblical connotation and meaning, which is we are aware of it, and it later moved to other religions such as Islam, and which is the source of inspiration of this Iranian Persian poet. So I just wanted to add this. I think it's yeah, good to be mentioned.
Elena, anything you want to add? Or maybe Elena's frozen. She has frozen and not come back. She looks like she had.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll add something then. I was going to ask Elena about this. We've got a couple of questions. I think that the point Christine made about soil is basically made up of decayed material is an interesting, and I think that's definitely true. That's basically what you were just kind of talking about, in that when you use soil, you are basically using that which has been something else.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing I actually wanted to ask Elena about this is that when we take a body out of the ground, we treat that body with sort of complete reverence, and it must be reburied or in other words, like it's still a proper thing, as it were. When we take the soil out of the ground that's surrounding the body, we don't do anything with it at all. That is, as it were, the waste. That's the unimportant bit. And as the way you're talking, if you reverse that polarity, so that you think actually the soil is the important bit, and the body is actually just the accidental bit now. Sorry, Elena, I'll just say what I was saying again. I did want to ask you a question, but I think we lost you for a second.
Yes, sorry.
Is there anything you wanted to say in terms of what Shahpour was saying before I get to the questions on the side?
Yeah, I think this topic of preservation through working with ceramics is very interesting. And for me, it's also a lot about, let's say, preservation and its inherent loss. Because the more we try to keep something as long as possible, yeah, often the more fragile it also becomes. And with ceramics, there's also this, this duality of fragility and strength, and also something that can last forever, but that can also become multiple pieces and not being intact. And I find it also extremely poetic. And this material, it's really, I think, drawing a lot on this questions of what time means for us, what memory means for us.
Yeah. So can I ask you a very practical question, Elena? I mean, if you are collecting some soil and working with some soil, would a piece of pottery be a bit of waste in your soil? Is it something that has to be filtered out, or is it just there, if you see what I mean? I'm just thinking about your different projects might treat the same materials in completely different ways.
Exactly, it's very interesting because when you look at soil like so close by, you see different elements in it.
Sure.
But and also ceramics for sure, because I think the pieces of fired clay are really spread around quite a lot, and it's an interesting element addition. I must say that there's also a lot of plastic though, and that's another super interesting element to consider.
But plastic is the thing that is not going to be subject to the cycles we've talked about, isn't it? I mean, that's one of the problems of it. So before I get to questions at the side, I might ask Shahpour, do you find plastic as a contaminant in your, because you've talked about getting rid of the water, but with plastic, presumably you could either incorporate it, could you, or would it be a contaminant that you'd have to remove? Again, the idea of what's useful and what's waste, if you see what I mean. Like what's for a purpose and what's different to the purpose, I think is what we're trying to look at.
We have a type of clay that you don't need to fire it, and it's actually is a type of plastic. It's based on plastic. So it's interesting how we brought plastic now to pottery, to ceramic practice, and you don't need to fire it, and it just air dry clay. And I've been working with it, and it's quite interesting to see how it's reacting different. And so so that's one aspect of plastic used as clay right now. So it makes it more accessible for people to use it. The other things is, yes, we get clay, we get plastic in clay, and because we recycle clay, and sometimes we get plastic. But the thing is, you always lose it when you fire the piece. I don't know, with the amount of plastic we have in nature today, how it's going to affect our practice in future. So like, is it possible to see that it's changing the medium or not? Or is it that much of plastic that's going to change something? I'm not sure about that.
I don't know.
But yeah, but it's part of the history again. I mean, this is like archaeological aspects of the modern day we live in, that we leave behind, and I guess in future they can see that layer and find it, because it's like a revolution of plastic, and then we have it in our daily life, and it's actually we have it in our body now.
Yeah, of course we do. Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad that you mentioned archaeology, because I was going to talk to Elena about archaeology, because I've done a very, very tiny bit of archaeology in the past, and the first thing they do is say, this is what different types of soil look like. This is an alkaline soil, this is a clay type soil, and you can dig down, you can find out what's going to get preserved and what's going to get decayed depending on the different kind of soil that it's in. So I quite like the idea of you displacing soil from all over the world, all different places, and putting it in the same place, just because that in itself creates an artificial new way of being soil, as it were.
Definitely, yeah.
Good.
A different landscape. A different landscape with different layers, yeah. But sometimes I question it, like even if I take a handful of soil from one place and bring it to another, what am I creating? What is the relationship of this soil with its original location? So I also create my own kind of rules, a handful of soil is a handful of soil. And after that, it becomes a major displacement.
Okay, that's very poetic and quite biblical, the handful of soil being put in together. So I'm gonna, because of that and the memory, I'm gonna turn to a question that Christine asked a while ago, which is about hoarding. But I think we can talk about it in terms of the thing that hoarding raises as well. So Christine's asked, could you talk a bit more about the nature of hoarding? For instance, when is it about retaining memories and traditions or touching past cultures? And when is it about retaining things that may be useful for the future? And then when does it spill over into an illness? What role does superstition or religion play? So I might make that a bit wider, if you don't mind, Christine, by saying not just about hoarding, but about our relationship with materials, the wanting to preserve materials, etc. I mean, I can think of many stories where people, you know, and it's a cinematic cliche in a way, that you go back to your home soil. You know, you step over the border and you kiss the soil, kind of thing, and the earth becomes very important for you because it somehow holds you in some respect. So I just wonder if we are, in a sense, hoarding ideas about our own identity through these material cultures in some respect, and that you're deliberately displacing them, Elena, and that you're deliberately preserving them, Shahpour, if you see what I mean, by firing them into pottery. Any thoughts on that? Christy's just added, sorry, the Pope always kisses the soil of another country when they arrive there.
That's a beautiful gesture.
The other things is interesting is we saw some, I mean, in many different historical, you know, accounts, and also in modern warfare, that when a country or when a nation occupying another country or people, they're destroying their graveyards, because the graveyards are, it has a symbolic meaning of a people that they lived in that, you know, soil.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting again, because somehow civilizations are hoarding culture, hoarding memories, and even bodies, because bodies representing the life in that territory or country. And the fact that the other nation, they always taking over a land, part of that cleansing is removing the graveyard is interesting too, because what they try to remove the hoard that made by the people of the land.
Yeah. And I also think it's quite interesting that what we do with, we let the body dissolve, as it were, in the soil underground. So that's the bit we forget about, but we memorialize the person that was by the stuff on top of the ground, which is the gravestone or the however we memorialize, etc. So we're kind of hoarding the person that was, whilst keeping out of sight the body that's decaying, as it were.
Yeah, the fact that the body is turned into a monument is very interesting for me.
Yeah.
That's what I try to do in this project, which is I use the human skull as the way to make a monument out of that human or the intellectual person.
I mean, it strikes me that what we think about as, to move the topic slightly over it, I mean, the human body that we think of as the body is kind of the human cultural body. I mean, because, you know, if we think of it as the physical body, we're kind of like ecosystems. There's loads of billions of microbes inside us, around us, and so we're not like a single thing. But the thing we want to preserve as a memory is us as a single, organic, discrete, separate thing. And this, and I think that both of your practices kind of question that, and also and also talk about the relationship between the cultural body and the actual body, the earthly body.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. I think also to get back to your question of how, let's say, by we're trying to create this connection to our identity by touching soil, by being in contact. But I think it's not only identity, it's also, let's say, the spiritual connection that existed always. And I think now it's maybe also reconnected to more culturally, but there is for sure something going on as a, on a spiritual level with the ground. And that's I think in different way we are reproducing it. And now also, like, let's say when we call the soil, when we discover the soil is polluted and we try to remediate it, to heal the soil, and to care for soil, there's a lot about controlling, about, let's say, establishing sort of power over it, but there's also this pure necessity to have the connection to soil, to have it around, to be in contact, I guess. And what you talk, Shahpour, also about, you know, removing the gravestones, like really, it's also something about establishing power, this act of controlling in a way. That's what I think also in both our approaches to practices, we touch upon these things.
I was literally, I'm really glad you said that, because I was going to, so Will asked a question a while ago, a very philosophical question, which I'm not going to answer or address philosophically. Do all materials have to be for something, or can they just exist? So I think that that's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question, but I think it relates really, perhaps, I think you guys might be able to talk about it in terms of control, in terms of our relationship with materials. And materials being made to be for something because of control, because of the need to control or desire to control. Any guys want to say anything about that at all?
Sure, I think the desire to control also comes from the aspect of making everything useful, to look at matter from the perspective of is it of any use for us, instead of considering all our environments more like as a kind of symbiotic
Sure.
atmosphere. So yeah, I believe we have to fight this idea of materials having to be for something, and more. And let's say with my project here, I also like to try to bring this feeling, this approach to soil more as a companion, more as something we can become with, something that we can coexist together.
I think it just the value is a very important matter here.
Yeah.
The fact that every material, when there is no value in it, we don't pay attention to it. And suddenly when we know, like, oh, whatever thing that is suddenly getting important, it brings interesting economical, political, and many other discourses related to that material. Because it's always is in a piece of land, and so in that regards, I have to say, I think it's important in the way that the way that we have this system of valuing everything on the planet, unfortunately, and so we don't have anything that doesn't have any value, and we don't let it sit for just being as something that we are not going to use it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. The fact that we don't have any, I mean, I agree with that completely. The fact that we don't have anything that doesn't have any value means that all materials end up being for something. Mm-hmm. That makes another word. And then you get the definition of materials as not being for something. That's just waste. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Within that value system, if you see what I mean. So the fact that you're both investigating that, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah, we are back in a way to this, what is surplus, what is waste.
Yes, no, absolutely, surplus and waste. I mean, the material that surrounds us all that we don't think of as a material at all, but may be valuable, is air, of course. I mean, air is a material that we think of it as almost the space between things, but it is actually the material that allows us to be in with all those things as well. And it's relevant to both of your practices as well. It's kind of the unseen material that enables the other materials. And I think there's a reason where air, soil, and clay they are that which supports all the other materials to happen. They're literally beneath the pavements. they're beneath the houses, they're beneath everything. And the processes that involve in making them as well are kind of the processes that are beneath all the actual stuff that we're surrounded with. So I think that exposing that which is beneath and which lets other things happen is a fantastic thing.
Mhm.
Yes.
And yes, okay, that's fine. And the houses are made of clay and bricks, yes, as Maddie has said, of course. One other question that I haven't done so far from Christine is about cremation. How does cremation affect this concept? And by concept, I think it probably means this preservation and waste, etc., and use of bodies. I would imagine, Shahpour, that on your view, cremation is probably as wasteful as burial.
I think somehow maybe because I mean, why we should burn it if we can use it for something, right? I mean,
no, sure, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, if we can feed, the birds, why not? I mean, I don't know. I mean,
yeah, go on, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, if you throw the body in the sea, I mean, it's gonna be eaten by the fish or whatever. If you put it under the floor, so it's just gonna be eaten by bugs and whatnot. So why you just want to burn it? I mean, just polluting the air. At least just put it on.
And also it reflects a peculiar human. I mean, one of the things that I say, a peculiar humanistic view of certain bodies, and that only human bodies and pets, which are kind of pseudo-humans, if you see what I mean, are the things that you memorialize and think they can't just be left to be part of nature. They've got to have something special happening to them. And it's so weird. We just don't do that with all the other bodies around us.
Yeah, we don't.
No.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
So it's a bit treating our bodies as exceptional and outside of nature.
It's again the fact that we have to memorize and also monumentalize the someone, even the pet. So that's the only reason we do that. I guess.
But one thing I want to end with, I mean, your particular practice, we fire clay in order to be receptacles for these things, because we know that clay is not going to itself dissolve or be dissolved by the material within it, if you see what I mean. It's a safe and permanent linear. In other words, once it's fired, I can't unfire it and turn it back to clay, if you see what I mean. It's done, that kind of thing. So it's a perfect way to preserve both the material and the memory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know how much we can extend this conversation regarding death and monuments, and the other way we can talk about it is interesting because we didn't cover it, but like mass graveyards, when they want to get rid of the memory or people. So what they do, they make a mass grave and just get rid of humans. So that's actually the other way to, so is interesting to use it as a way to removing my memory.
Well, I was gonna forgive me for telling a story from my own life. I mean, my great grandmother was put into a mass grave in London just after the First World War because of the flu epidemic. So it's a mass unmarked grave. And in the Second World War, a mass unmarked grave got blown up. So there was literally no physical geographical place. But it's very close to where I still live. And I think to myself, it's still in the soil, still in the air. I'm breathing in my great-grandmother and I'm digging up my great-grandmother all around me, kind of thing. So I do have, the same kind of thing as that's why I kiss the soil, because my ancestors are there. But to go back to what you were saying about value, that which is put inside a pot is that which is valued. I mean, it's a real sense of and what is not put inside a pot is just left outside.
That's true.
So they are containers of value, pots, I think.
Yeah, but pot that contain ash, it's also a symbol of
ashes, of course, yes. Yeah. But not of any random animal. Not of any random stuff, right? Yeah, it's great. It's great. But when you're an archaeologist, of course, a pot that's filled with random, that's been broken and is filled with soil and organic matter is the most incredibly precious thing. But it's still precious because it's inside the pot.
Yeah, exactly.
It's lovely. So Christina said this has been interesting about preservation. So I think that's something we've kind of talked about without talking about it. But is there any last words you'd like to say about any of those, especially you, Elena?
Preservation.
Yeah.
I think
nothing is sterile. I was very touched by the in your piece when you said nothing is sterile, and it's kind of like, well, everything is sterile.
I think that is more about that, you know, we have we affect each other, we affect our environment, we are in constant kind of dialogue, and it's really creating more combined elements. And that's what compost is, what humus is, and in a way, the cycle, the use of soil, it's also about kind of, you know, the continuation of it, maybe celebration of it in some way.
Sure, good. Maddie, you've appeared again.
Hi. Thank you so much, everyone. That was so interesting. I mean, I've literally written down endless notes throughout that talk. It was absolutely fascinating, and I have a lot of questions of my own, but I know we've come to the end now. So unfortunately, I'll have to speak to you one-on-one.
Yes.
No, that was amazing. I'm really, really looking forward to watching it back again. And yeah, I mean, everything. I think that all of your ideas have so many interesting points that come together, and everything you kind of spoke about value and waste and how, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's got me thinking about a lot, which I'm not going to go into, but huge thank you. And thank you to everyone who has joined in as well. And we are going to be having 2 more of these conversations coming up in the future with different panelists. So please do get involved, find out, come along to watch. You can come and follow us on Instagram or find us at www.mater.digital. And this session is going to be recorded as well. Well, it is recorded, and I'm going to upload it. So if you also want to rewatch it, then that is going to be an option.
Can I say thank you, Maddie, for organising and putting us together, because we wouldn't have the chance without you, and it's been fantastic.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Same.
No, I've enjoyed it so much listening to you, so really thank you so much. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your days, evenings, wherever you are in the world, and yeah, look forward to continuing the conversation in the future. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.